Okay, welcome back. So today lecture is going to be short because ultimately a lot of this stuff you are going to have to read on your own and really, I guess, make a study guide. I would create a graphic organizer for you to get the basic idea of all the biomes. So I don't want to go through every single biome with you because it's really going to be me reading the slides, and for the most part, it may, it's just going to be very factual. So we're going to run through, we're going to kind of skip over the biomes and then look at some of the nutrient cycling that you're going to have to know as well for the next exam. So next exam is very soon. It's going to have a little bit of evolution, mostly ecology on it. And then after that, we kind of wrap things up and we're going to have our final. So hopefully you're sticking with me as we move forward. So ecology, I've said this numerous times, it's the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and the living and non-living components of the environment. So remember, again, that's our abiotic and our biotic factors within that environment. So when we talk about ecology, it's really the study of ecosystems. And an ecosystem, as much as we talk about the individuals, and the individuals make up a population, and the different populations make up the community, when you put those communities together into um, a an ecosystem, or into, I should say, an environment that has abiotic factors, that has the water and the soil and everything else that's involved with the environment, that is going to create your ecosystem. So, all those ecosystems together are going to form your different biomes, and all the biomes together are going to form the biosphere, or Earth itself. So these interactions determine the distribution of organisms and their abundance. We talked about population dynamics, limiting factors. You should be able to have a grasp of what these terms mean and how the role that they play in looking at the ecosystem. So interaction studied by ecologists can be organized in a hierarchy that ranges from individual organisms to the biosphere or the planet. So biomes are the major life zones characterized by vegetation type, um, or the physical environment. So typically we're going to look at the type of vegetation that is there. That's going to dictate what biome we're looking at. Climate is a major factor determining the locations of the terrestrial biome because it strongly influences which types of plants, as well as the distribution of those different types of plants that are there. So when we look at the different biomes, you're probably familiar with most of them, but we can really look at any continent and break it up into the different biomes. So you see that you have a temperate forest where we live in a temperate forest, and you have more coniferous forests where there's more conifers instead of our deciduous trees that we see in our area. And then you have temperate grasslands out west, and you're going to have areas of desert, out in Arizona, Nevada, those are going to be desert areas. So you have these different biomes that are making up each continent, and within those biomes, you're going to have um, different ecosystems, and really what dictates the biome is the vegetation, okay, or the physical environment, and and a major factor of that is going to be the climate and really the precipitation that we're going to see. So when we look at these different biomes, we're really a lot of times a, the big thing that we're honing in on is really the precipitation, or the amount of water that area gets, as well as the temperature that is there throughout the different seasons. So climogram or graph climograph plots the annual mean temperature and precipitation in a region, and biomes are affected not just by the average temperature of precipitation, but also by the patterns of the temperature and precipitation throughout the year. So it's not necessarily just what the average is, but it's really what's the ebb and flow of those temperatures and precipitation, or the peaks and the troughs of those temperatures and those that precipitation. So when we're looking at things like annual mean, or average temperature and the average precipitation, depending on where it lands here, is what's going to ultimately make it, if make it a desert, or a tropical rainforest, or a temperate grassland, because these factors, the precipitation and the temperature, depending on what they are, is going to dictate what vegetation or what plants are going to be there and what the distribution of those plants or that vegetation is going to be. So you have terrestrial biomes, you have aquatic biomes, and when we look at areas where they kind of overlap, we're going to call those ecotones. All right, and I don't want to go through each one of these different biomes because it's just very factual. So you should go through these biomes on your own. In the textbook, like I said, make a graphic organizer for you to look at these different biomes and really see how the temperature and the precipitation is different from one to the next, as well as what is the vegetation like in each, and what kind of animals are typically found there, what evolutionary features are going to be important uh, in order to survive in those ecosystems. So um, when we look at nutrient cycling, in the textbook they call it biogeochemical cycling. A lot of times you'll hear about it called nutrient cycling, cycling or nutrient cycles. So nutrient cycles are called biogeochemical cycles because they involve biotic and abiotic, our living and our non-living components. And we look at gaseous elements such as carbon, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen. The big ones are carbon. When you think about carbon, well, why is that so big now? Well, we talk about climate change and how we are kind of throwing off that carbon cycle. We're increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, and that is having a great effect on the really the greenhouse effect, which is increasing our temperatures, and that kind of throws off all the biomes because it's going to change precipitation and temperature. Oxygen, obviously, we need oxygen. Sulfur is another gaseous agent that we look at. But the big ones that we talk about are carbon, oxygen, as well as nitrogen. Another big one also is phosphorus. Okay, this is a less mobile element, which also goes with potassium and calcium. But the big ones we talk about phosphorus, nitrogen, and really ultimately, as much as oxygen is important, carbon now. So these elements cycle locally in terrestrial systems, but more broadly when dissolved in aquatic systems. So the main reservoirs of elements are defined by two characteristics: whether they contain organic or inorganic materials, and whether these materials are directly available for use by organisms. So not only is it important that they exist, but is how readily available are they for organisms to use. So here you see you have different cycles that are going on. So if we start at reservoir A, where it's organic, we have organic nutrients available, and you have your living organisms, and you have your detritus, you have uh, de- your the material that you can decompose, right? Your decomposable material there, and then you're going to have fossilization and waterlogging, which is going to create this reservoir B, where that you have organic material, but it is unavailable now. And you're going to see in the soil that you have layers of peat created by peat moss, coal, you have oil, because of that the fossilization that is going on. And then when we have our coal or our oil, we're burning our fossil fuels, and that is going to create our reservoir C, where we are going to have inorganic materials that are available once again. You also have reservoir D, where you have unavailable inorganic material found in minerals and rocks. And by breaking down the minerals in the rocks in our reservoir D, our inorganic minerals are going to be weathered and eroded, and they are going to then add to this inorganic, this availability of inorganic material. Now, when we look at our inorganic available material, we can also make it unavailable by the formation of sedimentary rock. And then from there, you have your respiration. You have your nutrient uptake. You have your photosynthesis. You also can have this cycle go back from A to C, where respiration, decomposition, and excretion are going to bring it back to having available inorganic materials. So where we look at organic and inorganic, you're going to see how it cycles through. But these are four major factors for to consider in the cycling of water, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. So like I said, the big ones that we'd like to talk about: carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. Obviously, water is very important, but I think by now you have a general idea of what goes on with the cycling of water. Each chemical's biological importance is necessary for you to understand. That's where maybe you'll have to pull from Gen Bio 1 why we need carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. What are these important for on the cellular level? So when as much as we have gotten away from the cellular level of things, and we've moved to genetics and then to evolution and now onto ecology, where we're really looking at the big picture, it all goes back to that cellular level, right? All living things are made out of cells, and what really needs them at the end of the day, as much as we need to breathe in oxygen, well, yeah, we do need to breathe in oxygen, but why do we need to breathe in oxygen? Because our cells need oxygen for cellular respiration. So as much as you think about how the organism or the environment needs something in the bigger picture, it all comes down to now the cells in that environment or the cells in those organisms need these things. So there are major reservoirs for each chemical, places where things kind of hang out, and then you also have areas where they rapidly move through, those chemicals rapidly move through. So key processes driving movement of each chemical through its cycle are involved, where you're going to have to understand that. So when we look at the water cycle, it's essential to all organisms on this earth. There are very few organisms that do well without water. You have some cases where you talk about like the tardigrade, where it kind of can live for very long time without any water. It still is going to need water. So everything needs water. If it's a living thing, it needs water. They talk about aliens, and maybe there's some planet somewhere where their life force or their important molecule is something other than water, and everything's driven by something else. But on this planet, it's all about water. So the oceans contain 97%, about 97% of the water. 2% is in glaciers and polar ice caps, and 1% is in lakes, rivers, and groundwater. So water moves by the processes of evaporation, transpiration, precipitation, condensation. Um, you guys know this stuff where it rains, it's going to run off, it's going to be evaporated. You're going to have transpiration from plants, and you're going to have precipitation come back again. So that's fairly simple. Now the carbon cycle is something that maybe you're not so familiar with. So carbon is really what makes something an organic molecule. You need carbon and hydrogen for it to be considered organic. Most organic molecules are going to have carbon, hydrogen, and most all of them are going to have carbon and hydrogen. Most are going to have oxygen as well. So synthetic organisms are going to convert CO2 to organic molecules that are consumed by heterotrophs, right? Our CO2 is eventually going to become, well, in the most basic example, it's going to become C6H12O6, right? It's going to become glucose. It's going to become sugar. That's carbohydrates. Those are our organic molecules that we use for energy, right? When we use this creates our ATP. Now we can break those. We ultimately burn that carbohydrate, and it's going to create ATP for us. And that ATP has those bonds in the phosphates that are connected to each other. Now we break those bonds, and that releases energy for our cells to use. So carbon reservoirs include fossil fuels, soils, sediments, solutes in oceans, plant and animal biomass, the atmosphere, and sedimentary rocks. You can find carbon in all these things, and they're going to move through this cycle as time goes on at varying rates. So carbon dioxide is taken up and released through photosynthesis, and respiration. Additionally, volcanoes and the burning of fossil fuels contribute CO2 to the atmosphere, and that's where we see, the more fossil fuels we burn now, before the plants can't put the carbon dioxide into creating carbohydrates as fast as we are kind of adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and that's where we throw off this carbon dioxide cycle, and we are pulling this carbon dioxide out of these reservoirs a little too quickly. So we see that they can be in our carbon ultimately can be in our plants. It's going to end up in our animals. Animals are going to be burning our carbohydrates. It's in these decomposition sinks or decomposition reservoirs. You can see it in consumers, phytoplanktons, and all of this is through cellular respiration is going to be put back into the atmosphere along with burning fossil fuels, going to add it to the atmosphere, and then it comes back through photosynthesis. So you see this cycle going on where it really is coming from photosynthesis, and then it's being returned by cellular respiration as well as burning of fossil fuels. So another one that is very important because we look at its importance in really building our cells is the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is a component of not only amino acids and proteins, which is very important, right? Building amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Proteins are like the building blocks of us, but also in nucleic acids, which we know are DNA and RNA. And we know that we need our DNA and we need our RNA, obviously for our genetic material, so that we can make new cells, make new offspring. We need our nucleic acid. So the main reservoir of nitrogen is the atmosphere. So that's great. There's a lot of nitrogen plenty of nitrogen in the atmosphere, but there's an issue. We cannot take in nitrogen through the atmosphere. We can't breathe in nitrogen and then supply ourselves with it. So that's where we think about availability. All right, it's great that it is there, but it is not readily available for us as organisms. So we have this N2, we have nitrogen in the air. This must be converted to NH4 or NO3 for uptake by plants. So now we need plants in order for us to get nitrogen. So this happens via a process called nitrogen fixation. The nitrogen must be fixed. All right, it must be taken out of the air and put into this form of NH4 or NO3, right? We have to create ammonia in order for us to get nitrogen. So you're going to have certain plants, I think I've said this before, but things like lagoons, all right, they have these bacterial nodules that are going to these bacterial nodules are going to be able to fix nitrogen or take nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into NH4 or NO3 in order for it to be more of it, for it to be readily available for organisms like us for heterotrophs. So some bacteria can also use NO2. Animals can only use organic nitrogen, so we need to convert it. So organic nitrogen is decomposed by NH4 by ammonification, and NH4 is decomposed to NO3 by nitrification. All right, so now you have nitrogen fixing, nitrogen fixation. Okay, and once that nitrogen is fixed, now you are going to have ammonification, and then from there we can then have nitrification for it to be readily available. Now, after that has occurred, then you're going to have denitrification, turning that readily available nitrogen into now atmospheric nitrogen yet again, and that cycle continues. So here you see they show you have your plants, and you're going to have in your plants your root nodules. Okay, so in the plant you have a little root nodule and it has that bacteria in it. That bacteria is creates a mutualistic relationship with that plant, where the plant provides it a home really, and food, and the bacteria provides that plant with nitrogen. So you have that back and forth. Legumes are a big one, like I said, beans, peas. And then also besides legumes, you also have clovers. So if you ever see clovers in your yard, those are important for the grass, because the grass do not have nitrogen fixing bacteria in them, but the clovers do. So a healthy lawn has some clovers to it, or a healthy field or meadow or something like that. So um, where we see an issue is that we often are going to add nitrogen to areas, and those areas, so we want those the plants that we plant, the crops that we plant, to do well. So we add nitrogen fertilizers to that soil. Well, that soil eventually is going to have runoff, and then you're going to see that adding nitrogen to our aquatic environments, and that throws off that ecosystem. So, but in a typical kind of situation where we're not talking about how humans kind of throw things off, you see that the cycle involves the fixation of the nitrogen. You have the ammonification, and then you have the nitrification, and then eventually, once that happens, you're going to have the denitrification. Another one is the phosphorus cycle, where phosphorus is a major component of nucleic acid. So remember, again, it's important for us to have for DNA, RNA, but then also for our phospholipids, right? Where do we see that? Our, don't forget about our phospholipid bilayer. What's that? Well, that's our cell membrane. Okay, and then also ATP, right? What's the P in ATP? Well, triphosphate, 3 phosphates, right? So phosphate, or PO43, is the most important inorganic form of phosphorus. So that's where we need phosphorus. Now, the largest reservoirs are actually sedimentary rocks of marine origin, water, right, aquatic origin, soil and oceans and organisms. We see it in the sedimentary rock called phosphorite. Okay, and weathering of rocks releases this phosphate into the soil, and it reaches aquatic systems through leaching. So here we see in the cycle where you're going to have plants which are going to be consumed by heterotrophs. You're going to have decomposition taking place, and this is going to then end up in our aquatic areas. Eventually, you're going to have a geologic uplift, and the after sedimentation has occurred. So our phosphorus is ending up in our sediments, and then through geologic uplift along with weathering of rock is going to add that to our cycle, and then it's going to come back to our plants, and we are going to consume it, and it continues. And but when there's times when we are adding phosphorus to our environments, that is going to throw off the balance of this element in the ecosystem. So when we look at this in experiments in real life, you have different studies that have taken place. A big one that we like to talk about in just a general biology class is this Hubbard Brook experimental forest. So there's actually this forest that they've done ecological studies in since 1963, and they constructed a dam on the site to monitor loss of water and minerals. And in one study, they found that 60% of the precipitation exists through streams, and 40% is lost by evapotranspiration. So, excuse me, you see kind of the difference in where we see the amount of precipitation. And in one experiment, a watershed was clear cut to determine the effects of the loss of vegetation on drainage and nutrient cycling. So this is where we get to look at, what's the difference between what happens when we are going to leave something alone or when we're going to wipe out everything and try to plant crops in that area. And what they found is that net losses of water were 30 to 40% greater in the deforested site compared to your control site. So by wiping out those native species, by getting rid of that native forest and just planting everything the same of crops, you have an increase in the water loss of that environment. So nutrient loss was also much greater. So along with throwing off that water cycle, now you're throwing off the other nutrient cycles involved um, in that deforested site compared to the control site or the undisturbed site. So nitrates, all right, we talked about the nitrogen cycle. These levels increase 60 times in the outflow of the deforested site. So now you're seeing not only are you throwing off the water cycle, but now we're shedding that nitrogen 60 times, all right, 60 times faster than in the control site. So these results show that nutrient loss in a forest ecosystem is controlled mainly by plants, right? If you are going to cut down all the plants and then decrease all the biodiversity, when you have all these different plants, all these different types of trees and all these different types of shrubs and these ferns and all these different things, you have biodiversity. Well, if I cut all those down, I just plant one type of crop, you've really decimated the biodiversity there. And they see that when you do something like that, that throws off the whole ecosystem because now you've changed the whole dynamics of the plants that are there. And by doing that, not only are you throwing off the water cycle in that area, but you're also throwing off the other nutrient cycles as well. So this was a figure that they showed you how, once they cut down the trees in the not the in the experimental group, you see the control group kind of has these peaks and troughs, these very minor ones, but in the deforested area, it was greatly changed by the amount of nutrients that were lost by the throwing off that water cycle. So keep these things in mind as we move forward and as our exams are coming up.